clearly, when you look at something like South Africa's Working for Water program, that's a typical adaptation strategy. It wasn't necessarily consciously an adaptation strategy, but it delivers an adaptation response. And similarly, managing fire in ecosystem under changing climate regimes. But one of the biggest issues, and one that's very, very compelling, is that more people in the world die of environmental related causes than any other cause. And so in terms of just straight mortality, adaptation is supported. So we've really got to understand how you manage these systems to be able to deliver those kinds of solutions. And that's not so obvious, because if you walk out of the door here and go and speak to the average protected area manager, they do not know what you're talking about. They don't know what this threat is. It's a remote threat. They don't understand necessarily what they could do about it. So we're trying to now invest in guidance for not only how you would manage sites, but how you would embed those sites into national adaptation strategies and plans more collectively, which I think is, I mean, there's some good pilots going on here in South Africa for that. Okay, so I won't go in any further. I'd like to just mention a couple, I'll spend 5 minutes on a couple of case studies. In Papua New Guinea, the Nature Conservancy is working in an area called Kimbe Bay, and they posited some objectives for working there, one biological and one socioeconomic. And I'm not sure whether they've cracked this as a technology for figuring out the problem, but what they did was to start in a more conventional way looking at biodiversity priorities in that marine coastal landscape. They then separately looked at socioeconomic considerations, both from direct consumptive use, but also the maritime shipping complications and so on. And more or less doing a pretty conventional overlay type of approach, came up with what they would consider would have been priorities. And I mean, there's some really good science behind this, in creating resilient networks of protected areas where you would look at where the sources and sinks are, look at where there's the potential for conservation management to actually deliver those functional values, and figure it out spatially, so you know where the currents are, you know what the warming patterns are, where the refuge areas that are cooler are, and so on. And eventually came up with a pretty good coral reef resilience picture, and then using some community marine protected areas, started to draw on local knowledge and practices to actually secure the management of those sites. So it's a very neat and interesting place to look at. But I wanted to provoke you to say, well, is that what we'd advise people to do, a kind of sequential, stepwise, figure it out, dot by dot to dot, or is there another way of doing this? So what is the question in my mind still, because I haven't seen a single project that does this, is when can you take the socioeconomic and the biological resilience issue and pull it together into a single analysis that will deliver you a resilient adaptation solution? And the development community could be very much part of that, but how many agencies actually work with development partners? And so, you know, that's a real issue. So, sort of to conclude on the issue of protected areas, the argument that is made in this book is essentially that if you're going to do all of that, you have to have somewhere where you have control over the system, where either because you're trying to study what's going on or you're trying to work with a community. You've got to have authority, you've got to have legitimacy in place, and the model of a protected area, if it's done appropriately, gives you the potential for having governance and safeguards, for securing permanence, for maintaining effectiveness, and for checking it out as you go on. So in the last part, I wanted to just go back to, if you like, this problem that I face, taking over IUCN's Global Protected Areas Program, which, to be honest, is rooted very much in, if you like, a very traditional approach to conserving protected areas. Nothing like what I'm talking about at all. And IUCN as a whole has drifted very much away from protected areas to be, you know, talking about oceans and water and livelihoods programs and so on. But I think it's almost time to start turning the pendulum back and saying, well, if you want to manage forests effectively, how do you do that? What's the model that you put in place on the ground? How do you bring effectiveness to bear on that? I picked on 5 things, and I think it's really the niche of an international organization. What would you do as an international organization? I think the one thing that we've got to rely on is the membership of IUCN includes organizations like those you work for. And so all the evidence, all the skills, all the technical understanding, all the research is there. And I think it's incumbent on IUCN to actually convene the right groups of people and to pull together those global standards and guidance that is required to prove concepts and back up what people do. So the world's governments have agreed to doing some pretty bold things in the next 10 years. The world's funders have agreed to support those governments to do that. So it's really the issue of the world's institutions saying, well, instead of doing our own thing, let's try and align with this and do it. It's CAPE, okay, if I have to come back to that. The second thing really is that there's often quite a big gap between science and policy. Actually putting in place real understanding that guides to make sure that those investments are secure. And I'm not a policy wonk at all. I was working in a team of people that was their life, in Washington especially. But I think it really comes to my last point here, is that if we work with national governments who have the responsibility, and we are trusted partners of those national governments. So SANBI has worked, for example, right across the whole of the SADC region very effectively. Then we don't just give them a menu of things to do. We actually give them things that yield a result, and we can prove that that result actually happens. It's a hugely important step. Otherwise, we're going to be spending months and months of our lives in these fruitless negotiations that deliver really quite a cynical product. If the world absolutely wants to stop this problem, then we've got to go and pull the levers where it actually makes that difference. And it requires authoritative, scientific-based proof of concept and a valued investment to do that. So I feel we've got to be, I think we've got a new global vision on the table, but we haven't yet changed the outcome, and that's a challenge. And I think IUCN has got to be one of the organizations that does that. Going back to the ecosystem services issue, I don't think our job's over yet. We've started to articulate, South Africa articulated the relationship between intact, resilient ecosystems and water supplies. We've started to articulate a case for intact ecosystems and climate responses, but we haven't figured it out. We don't know how to do that. We're not advising people on proper analytical approaches. We don't know how cost effective it is. So there's a big challenge there to bring the biological, economic, and social sciences together to actually figure that out. But it's also about changing the question. Instead of always in conservation, and I'll just admit to this on behalf of conservationists, instead of saying that our object is is green, we should be asking the question, what does society need from conservation? We've always asserted that nature conservation is important, biodiversity is important, and we say, well, we'll conserve it and then you have the value of it. But it's not like that. It's really, what does the health sector need from biodiversity? It needs an understanding of pathogens, it needs an understanding of disasters and risks. And we can supply that as conservationists because we have that knowledge. What do we need to maintain tourism? What do we need to maintain water supplies? So there's some really interesting questions. I think another one is about governance. It's the weakest part of any international regime, both internationally, but actually more locally, is that these communities find themselves, if you like, at the last frontier, the last frontier of resources in the least secure setup in terms of the emissions, clearly. to actually do conservation in community as opposed to the way we've done it before. So there's a challenge here. One of the big risks that people point to is that, well, it's who's going to get to the door of these communities first? It's going to be the big logging companies, the oil drillers, and so they're very, very mistrustful of people actually turning their home, if you like, their cultural identity into a monetary commodity. So the big resistance that you get anywhere in the world is, don't put a price on this stuff. That's really dangerous. And we're saying, put a price on it, because if you don't, governments don't sit up and take notice. Fourthly, it's really about the economics. Jane, I think the issue has been, I'm sure you've had a look at the T report. I saw Jane somewhere, where there's really elegant arguments about why biodiversity is important and why you should invest in it. But the most powerful argument is almost the reverse economic argument that says, if you don't have this, this is the cost to society of trying to fix the problem that you've created. And so we've seen, by taking a study of the whole protected area system in Colombia to the treasury of that government, saying, look, it's cheap at the price. We invested in a study of all 18 Latin American countries to look at what it would cost and what would the cost of not doing it be. And the Colombia government immediately jacked up its budget. Because the biggest funder of biodiversity is government, not the markets and not civil society. So then finally I just wanted to point you ahead a little bit, because I think we did something really good in South Africa in 2003 in the World Parks Congress by talking about protected areas and the idea of going beyond protected area boundaries. We're coming out of 2010. We've got this, I don't know what Rio Plus 20 is going to deliver. We have a World Conservation Congress coming up in 2012 and the World Parks Congress in 2014. And my question is, in Durban, if you go through the whole proceedings of the Durban Parks Congress, you will not find climate change mentioned. The only resolution that had anything to do with climate change was that we need to do more research to understand the impacts of climate change. That was in 2003. And so my question in 2011 is, what is this question that we're not asking, that we probably already know exists, that is going to be totally transformational in how we think? And I wish, maybe you guys could come up with the answers. But I sort of felt that there's three things we still have to do, whatever else we do. The one is, we just have to keep plugging away doing what works. And protected areas work. I mean, they can obviously be done better because half of them aren't being done properly. But the second level is to say, what are these unique things that are being thrown at us that we should respond to, whether it's financial crisis or breakdowns in governance or wars and conflicts, what are the issues? And then as a community, as a conservation community, we have to say, what's the big wheel that we can turn that changes this? Because it's not just doing the same little old thing, spinning dislocated, but actually getting it to work at a bigger scale. And so that's what I'm thinking about. That in the World Parks Congress should be setting an agenda for the 10 years that follow. So we're talking about 2025 or so. That is transformational for biodiversity. That's certainly different from 2010, because if we stay where we are, we're not going too far. And so I think it's about this. I mean, it sounds trite, but unless you actually figure out what humans need and look at how natural systems can support that, we won't solve this problem. And it's so easy to say, well, if there weren't so many people, then we wouldn't have these problems anyway. But that is the problem. And you have to solve it. Otherwise, it doesn't go anywhere. And I feel that IUCN should actually be asserting itself as a leader in this field. And I think the members of IUCN should be insisting that it does that. That was one of the reasons, Caroline, for coming here today, was to sort of just put some cards on the table. And thank you for giving me that time.
you.